Who is on my shirt? No one knows. Her name is Hedy Lamarr. She was an actress in the 30s in Austria. She made history because she was the first woman to appear naked on screen. She was also the first woman to have an orgasm on screen. You may think that's trivial, right? But this was, of course, at a time when a lot of people thought that a woman could not physically enjoy sex. So it was quite a statement. She was widely regarded to be the prettiest woman of Austria, so naturally she married the richest man in Austria, who was an arms manufacturer. And she partied with Mussolini, she partied with Hitler. Some people say that partying with Hitler went a bit further. And then things turned a bit sour because she was actually of Jewish descent. So she fled to Hollywood, became an A-list actress there, changed the name to Hedy Lamarr. You may know her as Hedy Lamarr, right? Now, war broke out, and while she was married to this Austrian guy, she often toured his factories to look at what they were doing there. And one of the things that, sort of in the early stages of World War II, the Americans had invented the guided torpedo. And then the Germans invented a method to block those signals. So we're back to square one. And what she did was she developed a frequency hopping algorithm that would prevent the jamming of the signal to the torpedoes. Patented that, and then went back to filming movies. And she made movie history a third time because she was the female lead in the first movie in color. That was Samson and Delilah, and she obviously played Delilah. Now, the technology and the patent that she had was not of any use to her. It was patented in 1942, and it was deemed too complicated for a very long time to be used in anger, and it was only used in 1963 for the very first time, of course, a year after the patent had expired, at the Cuba missile crisis. And then she went back to her life, and she started a contest with Gina Lollobrigida, how many times you can get married in a single lifetime. And as you know, that was won by Gina by 9-8. Why do I tell this story? Right? The frequency hopping algorithm that she developed during the wartime is the algorithm that drives your Wi-Fi and the algorithm that drives your Bluetooth. Right? So Hitler's Jewish bimbo, who was famous for showing her chest, is also the one who helped stop the Russians at Cuba and the one who powers your Wi-Fi. So that is why she's here, right? That's not what I'm going to talk about. That was just to get the cameras and everything started and get everything back and get my mind back into what I'm supposed to be doing, and that is to lecture, in this case, about valuation. And I'm going to do 3 lectures on this. Today I'm going to talk about what is value, types of value, and show you a list of applications. We will run through that pretty quickly to make up for the last 10 minutes. And this is where we are in the sequence. So last week I talked about cost-benefit analysis, and I sort of assumed that those benefits, those fish scales from the Thames sewer, could somehow be monetized, could be expressed in monetary value. And the week before that I talked about pigou taxes, and I somehow assumed that the environmental damage that was done could be expressed in money terms. So that is what we're going to do over the next 3 weeks. Today I'm going to talk about why we would want to do this and the basic backgrounds of that. And then next week and the week after I'm going to take you through a series of methods to do so in practice, right? So that is the plan. And I'm going to start by the very basic question, what is value? And basically every school of economic thought, not just the major schools, but basically every school of economic thought has at its core a theory of value. So this is an important question in economics, right? It is, what do we care about? Economics started with Aristotle. This is what we think he looked like, or what they thought he looked like when they made a statue of him. And we think it's a statue of Aristotle. And Aristotle made a distinction between the value in use and the value in exchange. And the value in exchange is simply the market price, and the value in use is how much you care about something. And he famously came up with the question why diamonds are so expensive and water is free. And at the time of Aristotle, water was free. You just walked up to the stream and you drank some, right, if you were thirsty. And at that time, people were still able to do that without getting all sorts of horrible diseases, because the water was much cleaner and their stomachs were much tougher than our stomachs are. So water was essentially free. Diamonds at that time were fairly expensive, and to Aristotle that didn't make any sense, because you can't live without water, and regardless of what your girlfriend tells you, you can live without diamonds. Right? Diamonds are not essential to anything, really. Well, not at that time. At that time it was just pure jewelry. Now there are industrial applications. But at that time water was free yet invaluable, because you could not live without it, whereas diamonds were useless yet extremely expensive. And how could that be? And Aristotle and the scholars that came after that, right into the Enlightenment, that's the picture on the right, sort of realized that yes, this is the demand and supply. Really, in the short run, the value of something, or the price of something, is just whatever you can get for it on the market, right? And they realized that they were just not interested. This was just not an interesting question to them. And all the economic learning and all the economic research was essentially about the value in use. And what was that? What is the worth of something? What is the value of something? And Aristotle essentially argued that this follows from a moral principle. The value in use of something is what it should be worth, based on some humanistic reasoning that this is what it should be. Now that was the ancient Greeks. That thought sort of got to Augustine, the famous church scholar, and he sort of turned it around and said, no, value is what God thinks it is worth. Value is something God given. And that was around 400 BC, and right through the Middle Ages, up to Thomas Aquinas, essentially people kept repeating this, that the value of something is what God ordained it to be. And the purpose of research and the purpose of scholarship was to detect the mind of God. Right? And that is where value came from. Very strange worldview from our perspective. At least from my perspective. I think from most of your perspective as well. And it wasn't until the 17th century that began to change. And William Petty wrote this: labor is the father and active principle of wealth, as lands are the mother. A strange way of expressing yourself, but this is a long time ago. But essentially what Petty says, that the value of something is sort of a combination of the inputs into what created that, right? So wealth is a combination of land and labor. And recall, this is an agricultural society, right? With very little capital goods and very little manufacturing. A little bit later, the French school of the physiocrats changed that and said no value derives from land. It's a very French perspective, right, where the nobility rules, sort of hold all the lands, there's surplus labor, peasants don't really matter, right? And the only thing that matters really, that determines the value of an economic good or service, is the amount of land that you needed to use this. Adam Smith, working in industrializing Great Britain, turned that on its head, right? And wrote, if among a nation of hunters, for example, it usually costs twice the labor to kill a beaver which it does to kill a deer, one beaver should naturally exchange for or be worth, right, 2 deer. That is the labor theory of value, right? So Smith and the classical economists disagreed with the physiocrats and said no, the amount or the value of something is how much work was put into that. Now, Smith actually did not think of this himself, even though it's often attributed to Smith. He actually took it from David Hume, who in turn took it from Ibn Khaldun, right? And that's only now that we're beginning to realize that a lot of the classical economics was actually first written up by this guy on the left hundreds of years before, right? Of course, in a language that few people could read, and written by an infidel, right? Essentially. So we should discard what he was saying, right? He was not a Christian. Then after Smith, the labor theory of value was refined by first Ricardo and then by Karl Marx, but essentially throughout this period there was sort of this yardstick for something, the worth of something, the value of something depends on the input in terms of labor that you put in. There are still echoes of this. There's a group of economists or semi-economists or pseudo-economists who nowadays argue that the value of something, the worth of something, depends on the number of the amount of energy you have put in, or the amount of energy you would need to put in to replace it if it's broken. And here you see some names, goes back to Jozesko Rogan. And I'll talk about this more in week 11. There is also a group of people who occasionally call themselves economists who think that the value of something is driven by the amount of land that you would need to replace the damage that you're doing, or the amount of land that went into this, right? So even though sort of the physiocrats were superseded by Adam Smith and the classical economists, there are still economists or people who call themselves economists who hark back to this theory that was superseded in 1776, right? And they still go back to that. Now the details of all this are not particularly important, but the key thing here is that throughout most of human history, values are set by some sort of absolute yardstick. Be it our philosophy, be it our religion, be it land, be it labor, be it energy. But there is an absolute value out there. And the immediate implication, and that is something that you read from Aristotle all the way to Wackernagel, is that if the prices that you observe in the market deviate from the marginal worth of something, that is because there is something wrong with the market. The market is immoral if the price deviates from the intrinsic worth of something. So there is an immediate moral implication that something is wrong with the world. And all of these people are, of course, about setting things right. Now, why do I say this? For two reasons. First, the vast majority of people who are not economists still think this, that there is some sort of absolute value of worth, absolute worth out there. And the other reason is that it's actually very hard to explain what actually happened to non-economists, what actually happened during the neoclassical revolution in economics. And it isn't difficult to explain, or it isn't hard to understand why it's difficult to explain, because essentially from Aristotle all the way up to Karl Marx, some of the cleverest people in history got it wrong, right? They don't understand how economists see value. So it's no surprise that if you meet somebody on the street and you try to explain the economic theory or the modern economic theory of value, that they don't understand it. Because for 3,000 years or so, the cleverest people on the planet got it wrong, right? Or we think that they got it wrong. I'm pressing too many buttons. So what happened during the neoclassical revolution? Well, lots of things happened. And the three people you see are Jevons, Menger, and Ross, from top to bottom. And they are the three main guys who are the main revolutionaries. And essentially what they said is that there is no absolute value. Value is relative. It depends on demand relative to supply, or supply relative to demand. Value follows from consumption and production. There is no Bible or Quran that tells us what the values should be. Values are what they are. And they essentially discarded with this whole notion that there is an intrinsic worth to things. That by reasoning or by praying, you could discern, right? No, everything is relative. We would now express this as consumer sovereignty. Essentially one of the basic assumptions for the current economic theory of value is that people have utility functions, and us as analysts, we study what those utility functions are, but it's not for us to change those. It's not for us to influence those. The utility function is a given. That is something that is in your head for good reasons, for bad reasons. It's something you grew up with, it's something you taught yourself. It is not for the analyst to change or influence that, right? Consumers are sovereign. And of course, since a while, we've also known that utility functions are unknowable, right? We can only know them up to an affine transformation. And the implication of this is not that the market is moral or immoral, but the market has become amoral. The market is what it is, and we don't pass value judgments on these things. Just as we don't pass value judgments on whatever somebody wants to optimize, right? That is their business, that's not our business. And that immediately implies that values are relative, they depend on context, supply and demand, I mentioned, uncertainty. Something that is uncertain is worth less, uncertain loss is worth more, things that are unique are worth more than things that are commonplace, right? So that is what we as economists now take for granted, right? There is no longer an absolute value, there is no absolute worth, there is just prices. And prices are just values at the margin, right? And we cannot even know the true utility because the equation simply won't solve, right? More precisely, we nowadays work with two concepts of value, the Higgsian equivalent variation and the Higgsian compensating variation. And they were first defined by this guy called John Hicks. whose picture you see there. Higgs is the 72 Nobel laureate. No, I think it's a 75 Nobel laureate. Anyway, one of the earlier Nobel laureates. The sort of common names of Higgs equivalent variation are willingness to pay, and the common name of Higgs compensating variation is willingness to accept compensation. That is not strictly true, but that is perhaps an easier way to understand what these things mean than the strange word equivalent and compensating variation, right? It's essentially a meaningless, or there's no intuition whatsoever to those names. So the equivalent variation is essentially how much I value something I don't have, as measured by the most that I will give up in order to gain it. Ugh. That's awkwardly formulated, right? So essentially this is a supermarket scenario. Go into the supermarket, you want to buy a box of cereal. What is the maximum amount you would be willing to pay for that box of cereal? Right? That is the Higgsian equivalent variation. And the idea is that the money that you're giving up is worth the same as the box of cereal that you're gaining. Right? And that is why it's your willingness to pay. And of course, if the box of cereal is cheaper than your maximum willingness to pay, then you're better off, right? Then you gain consumer surplus. The willingness to accept compensation is a damage scenario. The compensating variation, still we can do the supermarket scenario. You just bought your box of cereal, you walk out of the supermarket, and some idiot comes along and knocks it out of your hand and it's all over the pavement. Now, how much would you accept as what is the maximum amount or the minimum amount you would accept as compensation so that you are made whole again? Right? That is the compensating variation, where you lost something that you care about. Hopefully you don't care too much about a box of cereal, and you're gaining money in return, and you're equally well off after the compensation has been paid, right? So those are our two key concepts of value. And they go back to John Higgs. And then, no, I don't. I think in 2 weeks we're gonna do this a little bit more precise because there's two variants to it that I will talk about then. So what types of value are there? Let's look at this. What's the value of this forest and this stream, right? What is going on here? How would we put a price on this? And what does that really mean? And there's two approaches to that. I will be talking about one in a minute, but I'll be talking about another approach first, but mainly in passing. So one way of taking something as complex as a forest and a stream is to look at what are the services provided by this asset, right? And you can consider three types of services, and they're typically known as provisioning, regulating, and cultural services. So provisioning services are, in this case, the water that you might drink, right? So this particular stream provides water, and that is something that we appreciate. The forest may provide fuel wood, and there may be berries growing, right? So it provides food, and that is what generates its value. There's regulating services. In this case, there aren't a whole lot going on, but the trees store carbon, store CO2. We don't like CO2 in the atmosphere because it changes the climate. So the fact that there's trees going and sucking carbon out of the atmosphere is a good thing, right? And that is known as a regulating service. right? And then there's cultural services, which is essentially everything else. You may just like the look of this, right? So there's aesthetic values. We may just feel happier if you're confronted with pictures like this. We may go, it doesn't look particularly suitable for rafting or anything, but you can definitely hike in those woods. Recreation, those sort of things are another form of services provided by this particular piece of nature. Right? So this is one way where you could say, well, value is complex, multifaceted. Let's cut it up into the different types of services that it provides, and then use that as a basis of thinking about this. That's not the approach that is typically followed in environmental economics, at least, where we split up the total economic value in a different way. And we say, well, there's use values, there's option values, and there's non-use values. And then use values fall apart into direct and indirect, consumptive and extractive or non-consumptive. Option values fall divided further into option values and quasi-option values. And the non-use values are existence values or other users. So let's consider a rainforest and wonder, so what sort of values are provided here? A use value, a direct use value, and a consumptive use value, a consumptive direct use value is timber, right? Or fuel wood, or nuts, right? That's a simple one. But you can also think of non-consumptive direct use values, which is not particularly recommendable in the rainforest. You can enjoy them for recreation, right? Or you could derive amenity values from looking at them, or you may think that they provide some sort of cultural value or religious value to you. Indirect use values are such things as carbon storage, I just mentioned, soil conservation. If you cut down the trees, the topsoil washes away. So the fact that there are trees is actually good for soil quality, and also it regulates water. If you cut down the trees, the topsoil washes away, and if it heavily rains on where there used to be a forest, instead of that rain being soaked up by the trees in the soil, it just washes into the river and causes floods downstream, right? So that is another indirect use value. But it is a use value because it prevents floods, and floods are damaging to us. There's option values, which are essentially use values, but later, and you might use them, but you don't do now, right? So it is essentially a use value, but a postponed one. And then there's quasi-option values, things that you might use in the future, but you're not quite sure that they exist. And one argument that people raise against cutting down the rainforest is that there's all sorts of unknown plants out there, and also all sorts of unknown animals, but they're typically just less useful for us. And those plants may have the cure for cancer. It may be that there's some sort of magical compound in there that, well, not magical, it's a chemical compound that cures a nasty disease. And if you then cut down the rainforest, then that plant will go extinct and we will never know what we've lost, right? That is typically referred to as a quasi-option value, because you're not sure that it's there. But if it were there, it would be a bad thing to lose, right? And then there are the non-use values, and that may be that it's a value to somebody else. You may not particularly like the rainforest, but you can imagine that your children will, and therefore you want to preserve the rainforest because you think they will be of use to your children. That's a bequest value. It can of course be other people that you care about in the future, and it can just be other people, right? That it's not so much that I care about rainforest, but I care about you guys, and you guys I know care about rainforest, and therefore I also care about rainforest, right? And then there's just the pure existence value. Just the fact that the rainforest exists, even though I have no plans for my children to go traipsing around there. I don't believe there's a cure for cancer hiding in the woods. I don't eat nuts or anything like that. I can still appreciate the fact that there is a rainforest out there. And even though I have no interaction with the rainforest, either directly or indirectly, I may still be willing to pay to help preserve the rainforest, right? That's an existence value. So all those things are out there, and they all are positive, right? They all exist. So, we talked about what is value, we talked about types of value. It's going to be a short lecture because I'm in chapter 3 already and I've 50 minutes left. There's no way I can fill the next 50 minutes with what is going to come. So why would we want to put a monetary value on the environment? And I'm going to take you through these examples. Why would you want to do this? Well, if you want to compare the impacts of environmental damage to the impacts of emission reduction, you want to do a cost-benefit analysis, you need to have a monetary value. If you want to know what is the good tax and impose it, you need to know the monetary value. If you want to pay for environmental services, if you want to pay somebody not to cut down the rainforest, you need to know how much to pay them, right? If you want to include the impacts into the national accounts to see whether the economy broadly defined is doing well, you need to monetize these things. Or if you're doing damage to future generations or to other people by damaging their environment, you may want to figure out how much compensation you would want to pay or how much compensation the courts would force you to pay for this, right? So for all those reasons, you want to put a money value on the environment. And I'm going to take you through some of these examples. We've seen this quote by Rob Solo already, that yes, this is very cynical. We're trying to find the price of something that is priceless, is maybe your attitude towards this. But if you don't do it, right, if you say, we're going to do a cost-benefit analysis, and we refuse to put a pound value on the value. We refuse to put a pound value on the fish scales. Essentially, you're putting a zero value on it. Because as soon as you say, well, we can't do it, then it's disregarded in the analysis, and that's the same thing as saying it doesn't have any value whatsoever, because then it's also disregarded in the analysis, right? The equivalent implication or the identical implication. So saying, well, this is too difficult, this is too controversial, we're not going to do it, you're essentially putting a zero value on. So I mentioned those applications. Let's take you through some examples, right? So we want to value the atmosphere or the sky. We want to value a coral reef. We want to value a bunch of frogs, this is, or we want to value a mountain landscape. How would you do this? And what has it been done for? Right? So I've mentioned cost-benefit analysis. And last week we talked at length about cost-benefit analysis. This is one application, actually a main application of valuation. If you want to find an optimum, then the marginal external cost function must be estimated and expressed in money. And there's no two ways about it, right? There's just no two ways about it. So, if we consider a unidimensional situation, there's only one thing we care about, and we also think that more is better, then essentially we are in this situation. Yeah? No, now I'm going too fast. So A is greater than the midpoint, 0 is greater than B, right? So if we care about one thing only, and we think that more is better, then we should go for A rather than B, because A is better than B. It's as simple as that, right? And that's essentially what you do in a cost-benefit analysis. You maximize something in a unidimensional scale. Now, if you have two dimensions, and the origin is in the middle, that's why the O is there, and we have that more is better, and A is better on the X dimension as well as on the Y dimension. A is larger than B in both dimensions, then it's simple, right? You prefer A over B because it scores better on the two things you care about. But we haven't got a clue what to do with C and D, right? Is D better than A? Is D better than C? D is actually worse than A, right? Because it's as good in the X dimension, it's as good in the Y dimension, and it's worse in the X dimension, right? So we can say that A dominates D. But we cannot say anything about the relative position of C and D, right? Because C does better in the vertical dimension, but worse in the horizontal dimension. And if we care both horizontally and vertically, C better than D? We don't know, right? And we cannot know, right? This is just, you cannot define an optimum in two dimensions. You can only define an optimum in a single dimension. So what does cost-benefit analysis do? It essentially defines a welfare function, W, that is a linear combination of X and Y. And as soon as you say, well, we add the X dimension to the Y dimension with a proper exchange rate between X and Y, then we are unidimensional again and we can find an optimum, right? That is essentially the purpose of monetary valuation in cost-benefit analysis. So X may be the costs of environmental protection, Y may be the benefits of environmental protection measured in the number of frogs that are saved, but you cannot add frogs and pounds, so you somehow need an A that gives you the pounds per frog, right? That is what monetary valuation is about. Now this is a linear combination, so we don't have to do this in money, right? We can also do it the other way around and say that X is the number of frogs, Y is the cost that we spend, and A is the number of frogs per pound. We can express everything in frog equivalents, right? It would be very unusual, but it's possible, right? Mathematically, it's identical whether you do X plus AY or 1 over A times X plus Y, right? The result is the same. So that is cost-benefit analysis. Last week I promised that I'd speak a bit more about multi-criteria analysis. There's two forms of multi-criteria analysis. One I already did, right? I pointed at D and I said, well, in one dimension, D and A are equivalent. In another dimension, A is better than D. So A must be better than D, right? So that is what multi-criteria analysis does. In one incarnation, it sorts through all the alternatives and throws out the alternatives that are dominated in one set. That cannot be optimal, and that would eliminate D. And sometimes you're lucky when you do a multi-criteria analysis of this sort that you sort of are left with one option only, and then you know what to do. The other form of multi-criteria analysis is to do cost-benefit analysis, but say rather than our welfare or our objective function is a linear combination of the things we care about, we say it's some function of the things we care about. Right? Which does not really solve the problem, because then you need to still decide what is that function. But the idea is here that you stick all those attributes into a function that creates a value, and then you're in a unidimensional situation again, and you can sort of find an optimum. Right? So that is why we value things if we do a benefit cost analysis. But as I said, there's other applications, and in the first application, the Deepwater Horizon is on fire. It was 2010, so you may recall this, right? You were definitely aware and conscious at the time. The Deepwater Horizon, it's a big accident, right? A big explosion, an enormous oil spill. I forget how many people were killed. Actually, George's notes don't tell me how many people were killed. George only cares about the environment. So lots and lots of birds, lots and lots of birds and fish were killed, but also a good few people who worked on the station. And this was an oil rig that was run by a company that at that time wanted to be known as Beyond Petroleum, right? It has now changed its name to BP. It used to be British Petroleum, then it became BP, then it became Beyond Petroleum, and now it's BP again, because they're actually not Beyond Petroleum. This Deepwater Horizon accident was a direct result of them moving into renewables. So Brown, the then chairman, wanted to make his company a green company and win all the credentials of that, but he also did not want to lose his investors. And for a number of years they were the marvel of the world, because they were investing all this money into what was at that time everybody thought an uneconomic project in renewables, wind and solar, but their returns were still very high. Their profit margins were still very good. And it turned out later that the reason that they managed this by cutting corners on safety, right? And this is the manifestation of that. And this is the manifestation of that. A major oil spill that is not too good if you are a bird. So, the question that they could have done is, if we wanted to prevent this oil spill, how much should we have been paying? And that is, what is the value of the damage that was done, and therefore you multiply it with the probability, how much should we be willing to pay to prevent this sort of stuff from happening. Another grounds for using monetary valuation is tax and regulation, and here we're looking at an example of quarrying, which creates noise, it creates dust, it creates vibrations, it contaminates the water, there's all sorts of impacts on the landscape, it may destroy heritage, and it may damage wildlife, right? And if you want to prevent that, you need to internalize that externality, right? And these are externalities. You quarry to get stone out and gravel and those sort of things. That is why you do this. And the noise that you generate and the dust that you generate is an unintended consequence, right? This is not why you quarry. You don't quarry to make dust. And it's typically uncompensated. That is, the people in the neighborhood suffer from this dust and have no choice but to suffer from this dust. So we want to internalize this externality, so you want to know the PGU tax. Now, I actually forget what DETR stands for, Environment, Transport and the Regions, I think. This is one of the departments of the UK government, right? So they wanted to set a levy on this to internalize the externality or at least reduce its use, and they commissioned a whole bunch of valuation exercises to assess the externalities, and as a result they imposed an aggregate levy. So every time you go in with one of those big things and scoop out rock or other things, you pay a levy to the government in order to internalize that damage. And they estimated the willingness to accept, which was £9 per tonne, and the willingness to pay was set at £2 per tonne, and the government followed, picked a lower number of the two, and that is the levy that is currently set. Right? So this is a real application of these things. The same is true for landfill. There's a landfill tax on toxicity, on noise, on odor, on visual impact. They all have sort of separate components. So if you want to have a landfill and you want to dump a ton of material in that landfill, you pay a fixed amount per ton. There's also a methane component, a greenhouse gas component in there that yours truly helped estimate, right? And then, of course, we have the air passenger duty in the UK as well, which aims to reduce greenhouse gases. So every time you board a plane, you pay the government for the CO2 you're emitting. Not quite, right? It's a fixed amount, so depending on whether you're flying a short distance or a long distance, you always pay the same air passenger duty. If you fly in an old plane or a new plane, if you fly in a plane that is half full or not overcrowded or completely full, you pay the same duty, right? So it's not quite a PGU tax, but it is inspired by this. Two more applications. Payments for environmental services. So how are you going to stop this bulldozer, right? That is about to take a whole bunch of forest down. You can try legislation, but you may have been following the news in Brazil, right? So legislation works fine as long as you have a government that is sympathetic for that. But then you elect somebody like Bolsonaro, and he says, forget it, we're not going to protect the Amazon anymore, right? Because it's more important to grow rich than to have forest in our country. So legislation depends on the government, and governments can do idiotic things. Just look at Westminster. Or you could try and pay whoever commands that bulldozer, which is not the same as whoever drives the bulldozer, to not to do it, right? And that is a so-called payment for environmental services, where you give somebody money and in return they stop damaging the environment. The difference between a payment for an environmental service and a subsidy is that a subsidy comes from the government, and a payment for an environmental service typically comes from an NGO or from a foreign government, right? So what you want to do is a bit of an idealistic example that George put up here. You want to demonstrate the total economic value compared to alternative land values. It's preserving the rainforest better than turning it into pasture land, right? To have cows on and make hamburgers and steak. And if you can sort of show that the rainforest has a greater value than the pasture land, and you can find people who are willing to pay the difference, that is of course the harder bit, perhaps, then you can just go into those landowners and say, we're going to pay you not to cut down the rainforest, right? And this sort of schemes are often informed by cost-benefit analysis, and I'll come back to this in week 7. An environmental valuation might save the rainforest, right? I've said all these things, right? Also coming back to codes in week 7. And these things happen, right? It's not that this is some sort of idealized scheme. It's not that this is some sort of thing that an academic dreamt up in the ivory tower. No, this is what people do. And here we see an example 8 years ago where essentially Ecuador had a plan to start drilling for oil in the rainforest, and the world, or some governments and some movie stars got together and paid them £75 million, no, 75 million pounds, and said, no, don't drill, right? And the government of Ecuador thought this was a good deal because they did not think they could make so much money out of drilling for oil. They thought it was a better deal, and therefore they stopped the project. So you need to know what is there. The issue here is that it can be turned around, right? And we've seen examples of that where unscrupulous people sort of turned around and said, I'm going to cut down this piece of forest unless you pay me, right? So people can abuse this system. The only example of this happening that I can think of at the moment is the emission of HFCs in China, where HFCs are hydrofluorocarbons. They're substitutes for CFCs. And now I'm trying to think what does CFC stand for without my notes. They're substitutes for CFCs. CFCs we want to get rid of because they make a hole in the ozone layer. HFCs don't make a hole in the ozone layers but are very powerful greenhouse gases. So a bunch of industrialists in China built plants that made HFCs and said, we're going to turn these plants on and vent the HFCs into the atmosphere unless you pay us. Now, why would they do this? Well, by now HFCs are sort of, anybody with a chemical degree can make HFCs. The bog standard chemical, the industrial value, the sale value of HFCs is a few dollars per ton. The climate value of these things is measured in the hundreds of thousands of tons, hundreds of thousands of dollars per ton. So yeah, it costs $2 to make a ton of HFC 23A, and it would do damage to the environment in the order of 200,000. So yeah, people very willingly paid money for them to not turn on the factory, right? And then they took down the factory, they complied with the payment and built up the factory in the town next door and did it again, right? So yes, you can abuse this. So you could sort of see these payments for environmental services as litigation records. Now, final example, can these things be used in court? And the answer is yes. And that was first done in anger, and people did get very, very angry, with not the Deepwater Horizon, but the spill of the Exxon Valdez that was somewhere in British Columbia. So this, the Exxon Valdez, right? So this was owned by a company then known as Exxon, now ExxonMobil. This was 30 years ago, so I guess before you guys were born. And it was at that time the largest oil spill ever. It actually has a date on 1989, so almost 30 years. No, exactly 30 years ago. I got it right. And it was in Alaska, in the Prince William Sound. So as a result of this oil spill, we now have double-hulled oil tankers. This was the single-hulled one. That means if it hit a rock, all the oil would get out. That won't happen anymore. The other thing that happened is twofold. So people took them to court because there was this enormous oil spill in Alaska, killed birds, killed fish. A lot of fishermen lost their livelihoods, right? And they essentially sued Exxon for the damage done. And then environmental NGOs got involved, and the state of Alaska got involved, and they all wanted compensation for the damage done. And they got it, right? In the end, they got a good few billions paid out. So that was the second thing that happened, right? The third thing that happened is that, well, this was essentially the first time in court that these environmental valuation studies were used, that the court said this is permissible evidence, this is how we should set the yardstick for the damages done. And as a result, this was used in anger, right? And people are still, older colleagues are still carrying the scars of this. So what happened was that a bunch of environmental economists were hired by Alaska and the fisher people and the environmental NGOs to put a dollar value on the damage done, and they did their best. And then Exxon hired a bunch of economists, particularly from MIT, including one Nobel laureate, to completely thrash those studies, right? Completely and totally. And as a result, there was this big flare-up in the literature. And if you talk about Richard Carson, for instance, or John Whitehead, who were in those battles, they still get visibly angry 30 years later about what Diamond did to them all those years ago. It did sort of push the methodological frontier. The MIT guys, the hired guns for ExxonMobil, did point out some methodological flaws that have since been, and we'll talk about it next week and the week after, that have since been remedied, right? And the final application that you may want to do is stick them in the national accounts. If we say that the economy grows by 3%, that just means that our material well-being has grown by 3%, But if that comes at the expense of us having cut down all the forests and spoiled all the rivers, then we may actually not have gotten any richer, right? We may have had more material stuff, but we may not be better off. And as soon as you start valuing the environmental damage that is done through economic growth, or the depletion of resources that are used to drive economic growth, you can sort of pick up, have we really become better off if GDP has grown by 3%, right? And I'll talk about it at length in week 11. So that's all I wanted to say. I see you guys next week. So next week we're going to talk about the methods for actually doing this sort of thing. Okay?